back. This is Boomer Life on CISL 650.
Don't need money, don't take fame, don't need no credit card to ride this train. It's strong and it's sudden and it's cruel sometimes, but it might just save your life. That's the power of love.
And welcome back to Boomer Life here. A little Huey Lewis in the news to keep the wheels turning. Our guest in studio is Brett Luckin. Mr. Luckin is a trustee in bankruptcy with Abakhan and Associates here in Vancouver. They actually have 5 locations around our province: Victoria, Surrey, Vancouver, Kelowna, Brett, and also Prince George, correct?
Not Kelowna, Vernon.
Vernon,
Vernon
that's right.
and Prince George.
And you
correct.
divide your time almost equally between down here and up in Vernon, right?
I do, although this week, as an example, I will actually be in Victoria.
Okay.
And next week, I'll be in Prince George.
Oh, my.
So I do.
Okay.
I travel quite a bit, yes.
I'll bet you do.
Yeah.
We're talking about, debt problems, personal debt problems. And in today's climate, boy, I'll tell you, there's just no shortage of them. We're going to talk about the options that befall or are available to anyone with debt problems. But we talked, Brett, very briefly about credit card and other unsecured debt as being the likely causes, or certainly contributing causes, to why so many people end up behind the financial 8-ball. The fact is, money's dirt cheap these days. It's pretty easy to get money, to get credit, isn't it still?
It is. As I said to you, I think actually before we came in here, when we were chatting earlier, I see a lot of people who come and see us and will list 4 or 5 different banks where they have a variety of credit cards or unsecured lines of credit. And really what they've done is they've run out of options at Bank A, and then just gone to Bank B and got another credit card, and then run out of their options there, maxed that out, and then moved to Bank C, and so on and so on, until eventually they've got to the point where now they can no longer make their minimum payments on any of those cards. And that's when they come and see someone like me.
And probably in that mix, along with the bank cards, there'd probably be a gas company card or two.
Yes.
And I'm just thinking of the other typical sorts of expense and fairly readily available department store cards.
Yes, there'll be a lot of retail cards. I mean, that's very common, of course. Yes, you see, I won't use the names, but you see certain retail stores very commonly in bankruptcies.
Right.
And proposals very often.
And it's simply a case of once you've got all of those credit wheels turning in front of you, that's all of a sudden quite a handful to manage, isn't it?
Well, ultimately it gets to the point where you can't afford even your minimum payments anymore. And that's really where it catches people, is where they're robbing Peter to pay Paul, but not on a short-term basis, but on a significantly long-term basis.
Right.
And eventually it just gets to a point they can't do it anymore.
Right. We'll pay the phone company this month, and we'll pay the hydro next month, and then we'll pay the gas the month after.
I'll
and
pay
then we'll
Bank A, and then I'll pay Bank B,
Right.
and the banks very quickly pick up there's a problem. And
Right. So once the dance fails, and there's no more robbing, there's no more money to rob from Peter to pay Paul, then the individual is getting the phone calls, starting to receive the nasty letters, etc., and then suddenly, Brett, it appears like, well, I'm really up against it now. I have one option. And I guess I got to go bankrupt. I guess I got to call one of those trustees. And the first thing that you tell them, or any of your colleagues would tell them, is, well, you don't just have one option, you have at least 2. So let's talk about the second option, which is the consumer proposal versus the ultimate bankruptcy, da-da-da-dum. But you also like to suggest there are even more.
Yeah, I like to tell people when they phone me that there are actually 4 options. And the reason I actually do this is because almost all of them have entertained option number 1 for far too long. And option number 1 is don't do anything.
Aha.
Okay.
Which is probably why you're making this phone call.
Which is why you're making the phone call.
Right,
so what I like to do is I like to paint that, because that at least puts them in a place where they understand that they have actually been doing that.
Right, they're a participant
already. They are a participant already of that situation.
Sure.
So doing nothing has the inevitable result of increasing your debt, increasing the interest, getting to a point you can't make your payments at all. And
if anything, increasing the hostility amongst those you owe money to.
Yes, and then there's the moving to the collection agencies, and then of course the worst case scenario at the end of that process is judgments, garnishment of wages, bank accounts, potentially seizure of assets, depending on certain certain factors. So I say, okay, well, that's option number one. And then it's almost so often you hear people go, yeah, I've done that, and that didn't work for me.
Right.
Option number two is really negotiating directly with your creditors. It is sometimes possible for some people, and it's bizarre that even occasionally they don't even realize it, for them to be able to negotiate directly with their creditors and try to solve the situation without doing anything formally through someone such as myself.
But if a creditor, you have to be at that point, you have to at least be willing to take that risk or shot at a creditor while you still have a relationship with that creditor before the creditor hands your file to a collection agency.
Once it goes to a collection agency, we find that even if somebody makes what would be a realistic offer to repay the debt, very often the collection agencies just out of hand refuse to take that offer.
Okay.
And sometimes we even find they won't even discuss it. They want 100 cents on the dollar plus interest and penalties, and that's just it. They're not interested in any discussion. If it's reached that point, well, then that's the point it's at. But sometimes it hasn't got to that point.
Sure, and so you can take a shot at picking up the phone and negotiating directly. Does it work out well usually?
Sometimes it can. It can, in fact. When you think about it, again, it's all about time. You're not going to solve it in a day, a week, or a month.
Right.
But if you say to yourself, I've got 3 or 4 debts, and if I just service and keep 2 or 3 of them at bay, for the next 6 months, I do a careful house budget, and I put as much as I can, I'll be able to write off debt number 1.
Okay.
And the moment I do that, I can now allocate to debt number 2. And then over a period of a year or two, and it's an investment in time and energy in yourself.
Sure.
And money, obviously, that you can write your debts off over a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could, in certain situations, and I have recommended to people, think of doing that. You can actually pay your debts off without filing anything formally, without compromising under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. Unfortunately, the reality is that many people who come and see me are way beyond that point. They're way beyond
way
that
past
point.
the point of no return. So then you're faced with the 2 options that I thought you only had in the first place, which is A, the consumer proposal,
right,
and B, the bankruptcy. I would assume that we put A, the consumer proposal, first because it represents the less harsh of the 2 options.
Without a doubt, that's the first thing I will look at. I will look at, can this individual file a consumer proposal? It's the first thing I will do.
What is a consumer proposal?
Effectively, what a consumer proposal is, you're not going bankrupt. That's number 1. It's not a bankruptcy. What you are doing is you are compromising with your creditors. You are saying to your creditors, I am going to repay my debt, but I cannot do it the way you want me to do it. Ordinarily, that would be 100 cents on the dollar plus interest and penalties.
Right.
Okay. I'm going to pay it off at a significant discount in many cases. It is often possible to repay your debt at as low as 20, 25 to 30 cents on the dollar, which is a significant discount.
And probably something you, the lone individual, couldn't talk your bank down to.
There is no way you'll get your bank
in that direct attempt at negotiating that we talked about moments ago.
There is no way you will.
You're not going to get that kind of rate cut, are you?
And there are some circumstances you can potentially get your bank to discount to maybe 80%, 75%.
But not down to 20 or 30.
Never you're going to get it down to 25, 30, 20% in many cases.
Okay.
Even. It's also interest-free the day you file. So what happens is the day you file a consumer proposal, none of your creditors are allowed to charge interest after that day. So there's this nut. It's set in stone. This is how much you owe as of the day you file. You get to make that discounted payment against that debt over a 5-year maximum period. So many people go for the 60 payments.
Okay.
That doesn't have to be done that way. Some people have erratic income, or they're on shift work, contract work, which results in erratic
seasonal
income,
stuff, that
seasonal
kind of thing.
work,
Sure,
that sort of thing. You can structure your proposal that way. And very key for many of these people who have often waited too long before they come and see me, there is something called a stay of proceedings, which means that any legal against you that's already started or already in play, such as a garnishment, will automatically be frozen.
Okay.
So no one can, as an example, none of your unsecured creditors can garnish your wages or your bank account. Or
what about those
rude,
ugly telephone calls?
They will stop calling because collection agencies, just by their very nature, exist to collect.
Right.
And the way that a consumer proposal works is the trustee is now the collector of those funds and then distributes them to the creditors. So the collection agency no longer has any function to play.
So what happens if you're getting, suppose now you're in the process of filing a consumer proposal with you or one of your colleagues at Abakhan, and so the paperwork is kind of in the works, and you're still getting these phone calls. So some rude person calls you up. Can you now say,
I filed a consumer proposal.
So call my trustee.
Call my trustee, and you will find they won't call you again. It's as simple as that.
Okay.
Is
that the law? Can you get the hounds away from your door by filing a proposal?
If they kept calling you, yes.
Okay.
That you can. Although practically speaking, the reality is that they're no longer incentivized to do so.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make any sense for them to do so because they're not going to see anything from you anymore.
Right.
Yeah. So a consumer proposal is a good way of avoiding bankruptcy, but of course there's a key to it, and that is that you are practically repaying your debt. Whatever that percentage is that we work out is going to be acceptable to your creditors, it translates into a monthly payment.
So does the trustee act as your intermediary, your agent with your creditors? Once you sit down, Brett, and assess a person's debt situation, and okay, here are all the people you owe money to, so now I'm going to have to gather all of these people together and pitch them on accepting a reduced rate from you because you're going to try your best to repay all of this. Are you that person's agent at that point?
The role of the trustee is somewhat more complicated than that, although from the point of view of the debtor, yes, we do represent them in terms of making the proposal
to those creditors. Sure, okay.
But the role of the trustee is somewhat more complicated in that the trustee needs to get disclosure of a whole bunch of facts and personal information from you, such as what are your assets, what is your income, what's your personal financial situation, how many dependents do you have, a whole variety of factors. And it's the trustee's job to also represent at the creditor perspective and say, this is a proposal which is fair for you to be able to repay.
Right.
So we are telling the creditors on the one hand that this debtor is making a proposal, but we are also telling the debtor that your creditors need to feel like they're getting what could be called a reasonable return.
Okay.
And the job of the trustee is to marry those two things together
Sure.
and make sure that the creditors get a reasonable return, but the debtor also gets an opportunity to discount and repay his debt at some kind of compromised level.
Okay, so a consumer proposal is a promise to repay existing debt at a perhaps reduced rate.
Correct. And that's where the challenge comes in, because that's the first question I'll ask myself and ask the debtor is, can you afford? So I would work out what that would work out to.
Right.
$200 a month, $250,
Sure.
$100, $600, whatever it is, and then look at their income and expense and say, well, can you make this payment? And if they can't, then the unfortunate reality then in that situation is going to be
bankruptcy.
Is they're going to go bankrupt.
We'll talk about bankruptcy after the break, but very quickly before we take the break, what happens if you go through the process of filing the proposal with a trustee like yourself, Brett? The creditors accept the terms that you propose on behalf of the debtor, and the wheels begin to turn. The debtor is now involved in this repayment program that could be up to 5 years. And somewhere along the line, the debtor's ability to maintain the payments goes away. And now what happens to the proposal that's kind of in the works and can't work anymore?
You've actually identified a key issue there. One issue is don't get into a consumer proposal where you're setting yourself up for failure because you're biting off more than you can chew.
Okay.
Right, that's number one.
But that's also part of a trustee's wisdom to say, we really shouldn't do this.
You're not going to be able to afford this.
Okay, right.
So that's one thing. But of course, there are factors that will affect you. You may lose your job. You may see a decline in income. There'll be all the other things we discussed, which is things like a medical emergency.
Sure.
Those are the kind of things which suddenly may make your proposal untenable for you. You are able to file what's known as an amended proposal. So a situation occurs, it compromises your ability to earn income.
Yeah.
It results in you being unable to pay what you were originally going to be able to pay. You can go back to your trustee and say, okay, here's my new financial situation as a result of some set of events.
Can we renegotiate the proposal?
Can we renegotiate that? And your trustee will look at it and go through the same process the trustee did originally.
Ability to pay and all of that.
And potentially there'll be a situation where you could amend your proposal and as a result pay less every month, which would still be acceptable to your creditors.
Interesting stuff. Our guest is Brett Luckin from Abakhan and Associates, trustees in bankruptcy and proposal administrators, online at abakhan.com, and that's spelled ABAKHAN.com. Back with lots more here on Boomer Life after this.
Canada's only weekly radio show dedicated to the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CISL 650.